It's the 2000s and you're scrolling through gaming forums. Then something catches your eye. You see people talking about a new game coming out for the Wii. This game isn't like your typical family-friendly Nintendo game. No, this is a survival horror game. Visually, the game looks bleak and uneasy. Excitement builds in you as more information comes out, only for you to find out that this game will never see the light of day. Nintendo and horror are two words that usually don't pop in your head together, yet the two aren't entirely exclusive. Many IPs have appeared on Nintendo consoles since the beginning. Yet, the idea of horror games on the Wii is something that both intrigues and baffles me. Exploring empty corridors and dealing with monsters with a Wiimote, to me that just sounds strange, but some have managed to make it work. There are a bunch I could talk about, which shout out the homie Zerk for making a whole video on them, but I want to focus on two specific ones due to the fact that they are lost media. Just sit back and relax as I cover these two cancelled Wii horror games. On March 7th of 2006, Polish company Nibiris would announce that they were releasing a game titled Sadness for the Nintendo Revolution, which was the original name of the Wii. In the article shown on screen, designer Piotr Ortowicki would inform of the game's details.
All I can say now is that Sadness is gonna be a gothic horror which will scare not with the amount of blood, but sheer atmosphere. Imagine a game in which you do not use guns or knives, but you will have to protect yourself with the objects you find exploring the ground. A stone, a stick, etc. Some examples of using the controller. You swing a torch with it to scare the rats off. You slit the throat, controller as a piece of glass of a knife. If you want to climb the wall, you will have to hook a rope over the piece of wall sticking out, controller serving as a lasso. And this is only the beginning. The game will be for single player and single player only, for an adult player with strong nerves. Let me mention that the scenario will have associations with narcolepsy, nyctophobia, and paranoid schizophrenia. The scenario will surprise you.
3 days later, a trailer would have been released showcasing a live-action conceptual portrayal of what gameplay would have looked like. We'd begin to learn more about this game through an IGN article and an N Europe article that were published in the last few days of July 2007. To note, both articles got their information from the same press article I could not find. Although, in these articles, the developers are trying to stay mysterious and were still trying to keep much of the game a surprise to the audience. They were restricted on how much they could share due to a mysterious publisher. From what we could gather, 2 studios joined in on production. Frontline Studios, who consisted of 30 people with experience working on Nintendo games, would be responsible for the programming. Meanwhile, 3D specialists at Digital Amigos would be tasked with creating the visuals for the game. God damn it, who's calling me? A couple of psychologists and horror authors were also brought in to aid production. In terms of the actual game, it was going to be photorealistic, but in black and white. There wasn't going to be an in-game menu or a HUD, and there was also going to be an invisible save system. The Wiimote was going to be fully utilized in terms of interacting with the in-game environment, and every action the player made would have repercussions. The articles make it very clear that the goal for Sadness was to be as immersive and realistic as possible. Eternal Darkness, Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Planetscape Torment, Ico, and Phantasmagoria were all cited on having influence on Sadness. The game was going to be released no later than 2007, plus we'd get a few additional images, including screenshots of the trailer, as well as a woman in a dress, a character with a blindfold, and several monsters based on Slavic myths, specifically the werewolf and the Lyco. Wait a minute, can I even show that? When I'm in a making monsters look like a Pizzenny competition, and my opponents are Sadness, Persona, and Fear and Hunger, there are also some music snippets included. The fourth quarter of 2007 came around. We got nothing besides a few more fancy art. People on the internet were starting to doubt this game's existence, referring to this game as vaporware. Let's just say, Sadness faced what we like to call development hell. In July 4th of 2007, an IGN message boards user named Ryan would email Frontline Studios over the skepticism of Sadness's release. Frontline Studios would respond, saying that they dropped the project due to conflicts with Nibiris. We'd get more details into why they dropped the project in an interview with former Nibiris employee and Sadness scriptwriter Adam, Artur, and Tolsky. It's here where artistic differences, along with deadline issues and the lack of a main designer, were stated as reasons as to why Frontline Studios left. That article is going to be super important for what I'm about to talk about next. On May 5th of 2009, Nebris would update their YouTube profile to announce that they were going to show off some new updates for E3 of that year. This leads us to an interview with Adam 8 days later. There's a lot of important information in this interview, but I'll start with when the interviewer asked Adam whether there was going to be anything in regards to Sadness at E3, considering that they announced their appearance at GDC the previous year, yet never showed up. Here's what Antolsky had to say.
We will see. Nebris always was better in promoting than making anything, so I'm a little skeptical, but I really wish them luck.
As I said, there's a bunch more important details in this article. For one, there were no more than 10 people involved with Nebris, including Adam. About a year after the trailer, the most items completed were concept design, a script, and a 3D minecart. From this, the term Minecart Gate was born. We also begin to learn more about the world and the characters. The game's protagonist was a woman of Polish-Hungarian descent named Maria Lengiel. She would arrive at a fictional version of Lviv, Ukraine. This fictionalized version would be turned into a gore-covered place of monsters that Maria could not leave. I think it's important to point out that scriptwriters argued over the setting, as Lviv isn't really as isolated as the game made it out to be. On the other hand, writers including Adam argued that the city would have been the perfect horror setting with its classic architecture and mythology potential. The game was also going to have a focus on Maria's son Alexander, with the player taking care of his needs. And Tolsky believed that this concept would have slowed down both the action and story, while making identification with Maria a bit more difficult as well. One last thing to point out is that many of the employees, including Adam, did not live in Krakow, the place where the company's headquarters were. This led to difficulty with communication and transportation. Months passed, and not only did Nebris not show up at E3, but it also straight up missed its 2009 release. Nebris' official website would shut down in 2010 after 2 years of no updates. Then on April 5th later that year, people waiting for Sadness received some heavy news. According to a post on a Polish blog site by a composer whose name will be shown on screen, the game had been cancelled and some tracks were uploaded. Comments were definitely mixed.
I'm glad we've crossed this watershed that will surely see the straggling idiots who actually thought this might come out finally accept reality.
I was kinda rooting for this since I love original content. Too bad. Not surprised though.
In October, Nebris transformed into a coordinator of the European Center for the Games. In other words, the company ceased game development. Remaining staff and projects would then be handed over to Bloober Team. This company is responsible for games such as the Silent Hill 2 remake and The Medium. Keep that latter one in mind. Drawing from an Unseen64 article that translated various Polish sources, there are also some more tidbits about the game that I didn't cover previously. These include the game possibly taking place during World War I rather than before, and the fact that 8 endings were planned. That's where Sadness' story ends. For now, I would have loved to see this game in action. It seemed so innovative, with its use of psychological horror elements and the Wiimote. I'm kind of unfamiliar with the country of Ukraine, along with its architecture, history, and mythology. So learning about this game made me want to learn more about the country. Some of my favorite games make the most out of those 3 elements. The characters of Maria and Alexander are quite unique compared to most video game characters. Now that I think about it, I can't think of very many mother-son dynamics in video games, especially if they're the front and center of the game. I mentioned a few games that inspired Sadness, but this whole time I was thinking about how similar this game is to Amnesia. They both implement psychological horror in an old European setting. Though don't take my word for it, I only played The Dark Descent, and I didn't even finish that game. Yet I think it's better to compare Sadness to a whole different game. Remember that game, The Medium? Let's just say, some consider it a spiritual successor to Sadness. The Medium was announced in 2012, but wouldn't be released until January 28 of 2021 for Windows and Xbox Series X, with it being released to other platforms later on. To give a brief description of the game, we follow the female protagonist of Marianne in post-communist Poland, who's using their psychic abilities to see into the spirit world while also solving puzzles and encountering sinister monsters. The game would have no UI and have a lot of interactions with the environment, like warding off bats with a torch. If the homages to Sadness weren't obvious enough, there's a young girl that Marianne has to help out, named, drumroll please, Sadness. Okay, so I've never actually played this game for myself, but it has been sitting in my PlayStation wishlist for quite a while. It looked cool, and judging by these reviews, it seems like a decent enough game. I mean, silver-haired characters are always the coolest characters in fiction. With that being said, I think it's wholesome to think about how a game too innovative for its own good would eventually turn into something new and successful, while also keeping the same ideas. The second game I'll talk about is a game known as Winter. For this one, almost everything we know about it is detailed in a 2009 IGN interview with N-Space president Dan O'Leary and creative director Ted Newman. N-Space, the company known for making games like Call of Duty DS, showed off this game back in 2007 to various publishers in GDC. The demo they showcased can be viewed, and from the looks of it, it appears to be your standard survival horror, with puzzles, monsters moving in a circular motion, fixed camera angles, and the like. As we know, the game ended up being cancelled. What was this game about, and why exactly was it cancelled? Let's start from the top of this article and work our way through the bottom. The beginning showcases a reptile-like monster, followed up by IGN asking what the premise of the game was. Pretty much, as Ted says, a very unnatural snowstorm took over a small town in the Midwest, closing it off from the outside world. The main character, Mia, would begin the game in a wrecked ambulance with no memory of how she got there. She then starts to notice monsters traveling with the storm. Along with puzzles and monsters, much of the gameplay would revolve around dealing with the rising snow levels and decreasing temperatures. The entire town is transformed by the frost, and Mia, and in turn the player, would have to keep themselves warm with what little they have. She'd even have to make her way around areas covered in snow. Afterwards, IGN asked where the concept came from, to where Ted responds with this.
Winter started with Eric Dyke, our late president, wanting to take the survival horror genre and return it to its roots. Lately, the genre seemed more about action and combat and less about actual surviving. What could we do to take the genre back to basics while adding some new twists? And specifically, what could we do to make this compelling on the Wii?
Ted follows this answer up by discussing the various elements the game would have brought to the table. These included setting fire to oily rags, finding the keys to an abandoned vehicle for its heater, and cutting open the body of a dead creature to get inside it. There was also no plan for a HUD. The entirety of a room Mia would enter could be explored for its many choices. Pretty much, the Wiimote was going to be a massive part of the experience. No shit. We also learned that there were 12 people working on the project, a mix of part and full-time workers to make the demo, as well as design and concept art in case the project was picked up. Since the initial trailer, the development team was hoping to make significant changes to the original demo if a publisher were to pick up the game, which, that was the biggest challenge, finding a publisher. Of course, IGN asked Dan about this, and here's what he had to say.
We pitched Winter tirelessly for months. The response was universally positive. Every single PD department was very excited about it and confident about moving forward. The look, the story, the overall tone and genre, the gameplay mechanics, it all came together to create something very compelling for the Wii, something that got gamers excited. With each presentation would come a wave of enthusiastic follow-ups from the publisher. There was so much clamor for the title, it was frankly kind of overwhelming. We left GDC that year feeling very confident about placing the title quickly and on our terms. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. In almost every case, we got hung up with sales and marketing groups. They simply could not get behind a survival horror title on the Wii. In spite of great sales for Resident Evil 4 and The Umbrella Chronicles, these groups were unable to support the projections required to create a viable P&L for the title. The idea of an adult game on what they perceived to be a kid's console was simply too big a leap for them, regardless of the enthusiastic support of the PD department and the Wii's total domination in the marketplace.
To add on to this, IGN asked if the game being an original IP was also an issue. Dan agreed, stating,
That's definitely part of it. New IP is always a tough sell. It's a bigger investment and a bigger risk. But the potential upside is also much greater for everyone involved. Whenever we'd remind publishers of Resident Evil sales on the Wii, they'd wave it off, saying, "But that's Resident Evil." Of course, you can only make Resident Evil 4 if you have the courage to try Resident Evil 1. Some publishers did suggest tying another license to the concept. This wasn't something we were opposed to, but it didn't get a deal signed either. Ultimately, it was a combination of factors that kept us from finding a home for Winter, most related to publishers not being willing to go out of their comfort zone.
The game was even planned to be a much more established title, with talks of movies and comic book tie-ins. I just want to talk about this cover art they show off. It's giving Nagasaki, Okinawa, Hokkaido, Yokohama. There's also another monster in the middle of this article that looks pretty sick. It kind of reminds me of a Left 4 Dead witch. This article ends with Dan saying that he'd love to release the game, and that carried on years later when Dan was interviewed in a 2012 Games Reactor article. He mentions that he has hopes to finally release Winter, with the Wii U around the corner and the existence of platforms like Kickstarter, yet nothing came out of that. Again, it's really unfortunate that this game was never greenlit, because I would have loved to play it. From the descriptions and the trailer, this game looked pretty great. In the alternate timeline where this game came out, I can't imagine the game being phenomenal, nor do I imagine it as a cultural icon, but it definitely had so much potential. The horrors of the cold, while not entirely unique to this game, would have proven to be an interesting experience when combined with the Wiimote. Plus, even if the game was never that popular, I can imagine it having a cult-like audience, akin to how Fatal Frame or Cry of Fear just got a ton of TikTok edits out of nowhere, especially due to the fact we're dealing with a female protagonist in the Midwest. Both the character and the setting would have sat with a lot of people. While initially I thought that using a Wiimote for a horror game would be a bizarre experience, but now that I think about it, it would probably be one of the most immersive ways to play a horror game. These two games I talked about really wanted to make the most out of the Wii's technology and the frightening potential their respective worlds hold. Considering we're talking about lost media for specifically horror games, some of you guys might have felt a bit unsettled while watching. Myself, on the other hand, felt more so at awe at what could have been, and maybe some of you guys share that feeling too. Whether it's snuff films or a Lost Kids show episode, the whole idea of lost media is a fascinating thing to talk about. Still, I'd love to know what you think. Comment down your thoughts, or any topics I should cover, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Take care of yourselves, and of course, as usual, please have yourselves a damn good one.